Hello, selamat pagi. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Timothy Marbun, and on behalf of the team, I would like to welcome you to the launch of World Bank Indonesia newest report, Indonesia Economic Prospects Towards a Secure and Fast Recovery. It is my honor to host the launch and discussion for today. Now, our event today will go on until 10:30 Jakarta time in this morning. Now, in this event, we will hear remarks from World Bank Country Director for Indonesia and Timor-Leste, Ibu Satu Kakonen, followed by remarks from the Charge d'Affaires of the Australian Embassy here in Jakarta, Bapak Alistair Cox. It will be followed by a presentation on the recent macroeconomic developments and outlook by acting lead economist for World Bank, Bapak Ralph von Doorn. Now, we will also have a special interview with the Governor of Bank Indonesia, Pak Peri Warjio, and we will hear the latest efforts on recovering the nation's financial sector later on from Pak Peri. Now, on our second session later on today, we will be focusing on food security amidst the pandemic and recommendations to support Indonesia's post-COVID-19 recovery efforts with a presentation from World Bank's lead agriculture economist, Bapak Animesh Srivastava, who will also later on join the panel discussion featuring other distinguished speakers that will join Pak Animesh, including Professor Bustanul Arifin. He is a professor from the University of Lampung, and also with Pak Sirojuddin Arif, a researcher at Semeru Research Institute. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions throughout the discussion, you could go to Slido. You could scan the QR code on your screen, or you could go to slido.com and type in the hashtag IEP Bank Dunia, and there you could submit your question. Now, we would like to remind you to include your name, your institution or media outlet, and to whom your question is directed at. The options of using Bahasa Indonesia or English are also available on your screen. For our media friends, there will be a press conference immediately after our event around 10:30 later. Now, you need to be registered as media to join this press conference. Now, please choose the press conference option on your screen to join. And later on, please do not forget to mention your name, your media outlet as you submit your questions. Now, we invite you to follow our Twitter account at Bank Dunia for the latest news on World Bank Indonesia, and also to join the conversation, please use the hashtag IEP Bank Dunia. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the event today will start with remarks from World Bank Country Director for Indonesia and Timor-Leste, Ibu Satu Kahkonen. Now, a short option to everyone, you have an option to listen to the whole event in Bahasa by clicking on your screen, or in English. Ibu Satu, nice to meet you again. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Tim. And selamat pagi dan selamat datang. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the launch of the December 2020 edition of the Indonesia Economic Prospects. As we start, I would like to acknowledge our distinguished speakers. His Excellency, Pak Peri Warjio, Governor of Bank of Indonesia, His Excellency, Mr. Alistair Cox, Charge d'Affaires at the Australian Embassy in Jakarta, Pak Bustanul Arifin, Professor of Agricultural Economics at the University of Lampung, Pak Sirojuddin Arif, lead author of the Strategic Review of Food Security and Nutrition at Semeru Research Institute. I would also like to thank the Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for their continued support for this publication and World Bank's analytical work in Indonesia. The world has gone through very difficult time since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Over 1.5 million lives have been lost worldwide, and livelihoods of millions of people have been severely affected. As most countries in the world, Indonesia is in recession this year. There are reasons to be hopeful for the future, though. But the road to full recovery is likely to be long and challenging. Strong and well-implemented public health and economic policies are the keys to accelerating and strengthening recovery. And let me highlight the 3 critical keys that we should focus on. First, public health is the master key to a fast and resilient recovery. For Indonesia to keep its economy open and strengthen the recovery, public health be ensured. Experience indicates that testing and contact tracing are fundamental to contain the pandemic. And once an effective and safe vaccine has been approved, the health system will face the challenge of administering it to the Indonesian population. The second key is to support affected and vulnerable households and firms. Several sectors that employ many Indonesians, are still in deep contraction. Unemployment and underemployment are significantly higher today than before the pandemic. Many small and medium enterprises face difficult financial decisions and an uncertain future. To recover these affected and vulnerable households and firms will need well-calibrated and targeted support. The third key is to develop credible strategies to meet medium-term macroeconomic and fiscal objectives. Indonesia's bold monetary, financial, and fiscal responses to the crisis have been critical. Moving forward, the challenge is to develop credible exit strategies from this very large policy support and safeguard what has been the foundation of Indonesia's success in the past years, and that is prudent macroeconomic and fiscal policies. And central element of this strategy would need to be a well-prioritized tax reform plan to improve fiscal space and reduce financing needs. My colleague Ralph van Doorn will go into more details on our assessment and Indonesia's recent economic developments and outlook. But before I turn to him, let me touch on the important topic of the current report, that is food security. Food security is an important goal for Indonesia, and progress has been made in the past decades. Since the Green Revolution, Indonesia has increased the production of staple foods, especially rice and maize. But there are some fundamental challenges. Food consumption patterns are changing, and wealthier, more urbanized population is demanding for more diversified and nutritious range of foods. Today, Indonesia's food security challenges are primarily about affordability and nutritional value of foods, not about availability. Food prices are significantly higher in Indonesia than in other countries in the region, and the poor cannot afford a healthy diet. Also, the pandemic has put pressure on disposable incomes and made low-income households more vulnerable to food insecurity. Indonesia's food system could be more efficient, not only at the farm level, but also in terms of logistics, trade, investments, and competitiveness. And the pandemic has highlighted the weaknesses of the agri-food system. And also this pandemic is bringing an unprecedented opportunity to adapt and transform it. And this is the time to take reforms that promote affordability and nutritional value of foods in Indonesia. My colleague Anime Srivastava will elaborate on this topic, and I also hope that the discussion with our distinguished panelists will highlight concrete recommendations for Indonesia to take. And I also very much hope that you will enjoy the rest of this event. Terima kasih.
The second Indonesia Economic Prospects launch for 2020. The Australian Embassy, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, is very happy to be able to continue to support a broad range of the World Bank activities in Indonesia through our Country Trust Fund partnership with the bank, including the production of these Indonesia Economic Prospects reports. And I'm particularly pleased to see food security as the focus for this edition of the IEP and the discussion today. As we all know, agriculture is a critical sector to Indonesia's economy, contributing 12.7% of GDP and employing around 38 million people. And the COVID-19 pandemic, as Satu has said, has thrown up new challenges to maintaining food security and has seen reduced incomes and disruptions to supply chains and food production systems across the country. But the agriculture sector too has an important role to play in building the resilience of the country and cushioning the impacts of the crisis, and we've seen evidence of that too. It's also continued to grow as a sector when many other sectors have suffered steep declines as a result of the pandemic, obviously, particularly the services sector. Ladies and gentlemen, Australia has long been and continues to be a strong supporter of the Indonesian agriculture sector through a range of our partnerships and activities. And this support is also an important part of our COVID-19 development response plan for Indonesia, our new strategy, which was released in October 2020, which focuses on the broad areas of health, stability and economic recovery. And agriculture makes an important contribution in both the stabilisation and in the economic recovery part of that plan. The Australia-Indonesia Partnership for Promoting Rural Incomes through Support for Markets and Agriculture, it's a bit of a mouthful, but the PRISMA program works with Indonesian government and the private sector to optimise smallholder farmers' competitiveness and their access to new markets, better inputs, know-how and technology. The program, which has now been running for more than 5-6 years, aims specifically to build entrepreneurship in agriculture and build the capacity of farmers through detailed research into individual sectors and then targeted interventions with specific groups of farmers in specific sectors and areas to help better integrate those farmers into their markets, the markets for their inputs, from seed to fertiliser to animal inputs, to production techniques and to market the end results into local and national markets. PRISMA is helping to inform the agriculture industry's response also to COVID-19 by collecting information from the farmers that we work with. And we work with, the program has worked with over 400,000 farmers so far, agricultural suppliers, traders and resellers, and on the changes to supply, demand and work practices. And through the Australia World Bank partnership, the trust fund I mentioned before, we're also supporting the bank, including the team represented here today, to inform policy development and improve agriculture-related public spending. This work includes a review of fertiliser subsidies and development of an agriculture public expenditure review. Ladies and gentlemen, we also support and have long supported Indonesia in partnership through the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, which undertakes research across a whole range of sectors with Indonesian research agencies in universities and private research, government and other private research agencies here in Indonesia, to look at how to boost productivity and grow individual agricultural sectors through then application to extension work and so on. And I might just commend to you a report which you can find easily online by just out by the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, titled COVID-19 and Food Systems in the Indo-Pacific, an assessment of vulnerability, impacts and opportunities for action, technical report number 96. This report includes significant section on Indonesia, detailing the impact on smallholders, looks at supply chains, impacts on employment, impacts on the community, and looks at many of the challenges from an assessment that was done between January, February, and July, August this year. So it's a very significant new ACR contribution to understanding what's happening on the ground in Indonesia and other countries in our region. Of course, open markets and increased international trade and investment are also important in maintaining food security and developing Indonesia's agriculture sector. Indonesia and Australia have diverse and growing bilateral trade and investment relations, and these have been strengthened by the Australia-Indonesia and Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, the IA-CEPA, which entered into force on the 5th of July. IA-CEPA will help support more trade in goods and services, as well as investment between our two countries, and contribute to post-COVID-19 recovery efforts by creating more economic opportunities for businesses in both our countries. Australia and Indonesia already have a long history of complementary agriculture trade, which benefits both countries and supports Indonesia's food security goals. We call this a mutually beneficial powerhouse effect. In fact, that was a term created by former Trade Minister Tom Lembong, which grows industries and exports in both countries along the supply chain. A good example is the $311 million worth of high-quality Australian wheat that was imported into Indonesia in 2018-19. That wheat was then milled into flour in Indonesia and manufactured into noodles, bakery items, pasta, that were then exported to many countries, including to Australia. Indonesia will also benefit from commitments on Australian feed grains under the IA-CEPA. Australian feed grains will provide a reliable and high-quality source of nutrition for animals that will complement products produced in Indonesia. This in turn will help boost Indonesian production of important protein sources such as beef, seafood and chicken, supporting the goal of food security in Indonesia and growing Indonesia's exports to third markets. IA-CEPA also provides a commitment on economic cooperation, the first time we've done that in a bilateral trade agreement. Agriculture is a key priority sector for this economic cooperation program. So finally, thank you very much to the World Bank for providing a very high quality Indonesia Economic Prospects Report, number 2, and continuing in the great tradition of these important macroeconomic reports. It provides a very valuable analysis for policymakers in the context of increased pressure on food security from COVID-19 and the opportunities and challenges and opportunities that face Indonesia in the time ahead. I look forward to the discussion today. Sekali lagi, terima kasih dan salam sejahtera bagi kita semua. Thank you.
Terima kasih banyak, Mr. Alistair Cox, chargé d'affaires of the Australian Embassy in Jakarta, Indonesia. Ladies and gentlemen, our next session is the presentation by the acting lead economist of World Bank. If you want to join the conversation in social media, please follow our Twitter account @BankDunia. And for today, please use the hashtag #IEPBankDunia. Now, we would like to welcome Pak Ralph van Doorn, the acting lead economist for World Bank, to present the latest macroeconomic developments and outlook. But before Pak Ralph takes the screen, here's a brief video to warm us up for the presentation.
Terima kasih Tim. Selamat pagi dan selamat datang di presentasi laporan Indonesia Economic Prospects. Yang terhormat Pak Alistair Cox, Wakil Duta Besar Australia dan Indonesia. Yang terhormat Ibu Victoria Kwakwa, Wakil Presiden Bank Dunia untuk Asia Timur dan Pasifik. Yang terhormat Ibu Sadil Kahkonen, Direktur Bank Dunia untuk Indonesia. Dan yang saya hormati para panelis, peserta, dan rekan-rekan lainnya yang hadir pada webinar pagi ini. I will continue in English now. So, how can we move Indonesia towards a secure and fast recovery over the next few years? So let's start here with the main takeaways. So we expect a rebound in 2021, but with severe downside risks. Therefore, we recommend to prioritize public health, to improve testing and contact tracing, and to widely administer an effective and safe vaccine once it is approved. Second, monitor and continuously improve the adequacy, targeting, and implementation of support to affected households and firms. Third, we recommend to develop a well-prioritized fiscal reform plan to make the recovery fast and secure. And finally, fourth, advance structural reforms for long-term growth, jobs and incomes, especially regarding food security. Now, of course, we cannot cover all these materials in this 50-minute presentation, so we invite you to download the report from worldbank.org/IEP. So let's get started. Now, as Indonesia and the global economy went through difficult times this year, we're trying to answer these questions. How well is Indonesia recovering? What's the outlook for Indonesia? And how to secure and accelerate recovery? And we're trying to put it nicely in a kind of charging bar, which is well familiar to almost everyone in the audience today. So the Indonesian economy is suffering from the COVID pandemic through both domestic and external channels. On the domestic side, there were mobility restrictions and social distancing, which depressed economic activity. On the external side, Indonesia was exposed to the shock through trade, commodity, investment, and portfolio flows. And we saw that growth amongst Indonesia's top export destinations contracted by 4.8% year on year in the first half of this year. And 160 countries around the globe are projected to be in recession in 2020, including all G20 countries except China. So as a result, Indonesia experienced its deepest contraction in the last 2 decades during the first quarter of this year, as you can see here below. Now, as mobility restrictions were lifted gradually, in the third quarter, the economy appears to be turning around, but it's partially at a slow pace, and we'll get to that in the next few slides. Here we can see strong net exports and a substantial rebound in public consumption as the government pushed to accelerate the implementation of its fiscal relief and recovery package drove this. But on the other hand, private consumption and investment only recovered partially, and domestic demand remains weak. Let's then turn to the external sector. So after the large capital outflows, a weakening of the rupiah in March and April led to large capital outflows. But after that, external financial conditions eased, and global bonds issuances by the government and state enterprises have supported the return of capital flows in the later years in line with the other emerging markets. And this has also stabilized the rupiah in the last few months. Now, external buffers are improving with the narrowing of the current account deficit and higher international reserves. This is mainly due to the fall in domestic demand and recovery in trade, including from China, and global prices of some export commodities. As of November, international reserves could cover 9.5 months imports and external debt repayments. Now, it's interesting to go just a little bit deeper into the sectors, because that's where we see, an uneven recovery. Now, let's just start from the right. So, less contact-intensive sectors with a high ability to telework, such as finance, education, information, and telecommunication, they have been more resilient. As you can see, the growth in those sectors have been positive or close to zero. But there are also sectors with a very low share of teleworkable occupations, which depend on face-to-face interaction with customers, for example, transport, hotels, and restaurants. They are still in deep contraction, although they're bottoming out in Q3, as you can see here in the dark green bar. These sectors are important for employment. On the other hand, economically important sectors such as mining and manufacturing, have substantial exposure to foreign demand. They are shielded partially from the drop in domestic demand, and they have been benefiting from the recovery in global trade and prices of some export commodities since May. Now, let's dig a bit deeper then into the labor market. So, unemployment is significantly higher than before the crisis, and 5.1 million people have lost their jobs due to COVID-19, with a substantially higher impact in urban areas and amongst men. So the unemployment rate rose by 1.8 percentage points to 7.1% in the third quarter compared to the year before. Now, equally important is underemployment. And underemployment is also significantly higher. 24 million individuals are working reduced hours, and the underemployment rate increased by 3.8 percentage points to 10.2% in the third quarter compared to the year before. Now, this doesn't mean that there is some partial improvement. In fact, we do see a partial improvement compared to the second quarter. And here we're going to focus on the World Bank's high-frequency survey of the COVID-19 impact, which we call the HIFA survey. And in the bottom left, you can see the link to those surveys on our website. So please write it down if you're interested. Now, the HIFA survey shows that share of household breadwinners who stopped working was 24% in May, but this improved to 10% in August. So it went down from 24% to 10%. Although we do see variation across the sectors. On the other hand, many workers are reporting earning less than before the crisis, highlighting threats to poverty and food security. The HIFA survey shows that 47% of people that were working in August also reported reduced incomes, with a high prevalence across all the sectors. Now, let's turn to the fiscal response by the government. So the government introduced a substantial fiscal package to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. The fiscal response was estimated 695 trillion, or 4.3% of GDP, which is a level comparable to China and Malaysia. China and Philippines, but lower than Thailand and Malaysia. Now, as we can see for Indonesia, its main focus was on providing income support and revenue measures. You see here Indonesia's, that's the third one from the right, while also allocating money for strengthening healthcare and providing support to micro, small and medium enterprises and corporates. It also cut the corporate income tax rate in 2 stages from 25% to 20%. So after the fiscal response, let's also look at the execution rates. So the execution rates of the packages has faced bottlenecks in some areas. So as of mid-October, close to 60% of the fiscal package, called the National Economic Recovery Package, was disbursed. But while the budget execution for social protection and support to MSMEs was on track, it has lagged for health, support for sectoral ministry, and subnational government spending. Now, after the fiscal response, let's also look at the monetary response. So central banks worldwide have introduced aggressive policy measures to provide liquidity. And Bank Indonesia cut interest rates by a total of 125 basis points since the beginning of the year to a record low of 3.75%. Now, BI purchases during the first half of the year were aimed at stabilizing and improving the functioning of bond markets in the face of a large exit of non-resident investors from the local currency bond market. And it was done mainly through the secondary market, which you see in the light blue bar over there. Now, since July, they've also contributed to financing the government fiscal deficit, which you can see in the dark blue bar on the top. And as of August, Bank Indonesia purchases reached 1.8% of GDP, about half in the primary market, compared to an emerging market average of 1.7% of GDP. Now, in October, these purchases rose further to 2.9% of GDP, about 2/3 in the primary market and 1/3 in the secondary market. Then finally, let's look at the impact of this economic downturn on the financial sector to see what we see here. Now, the system-wide non-performing loan ratio edged up slightly since the beginning of the pandemic, and the capital adequacy ratio remains well above the regulatory minimum, and there's ample liquidity. But loan forbearance measures may be temporarily masking the true extent of these vulnerabilities. And we see this in the sharp increase in what is called loans at risk, which reached above 20% of loans in June. Now, these are structured loans under the National Economic Recovery Program and they have not yet been classified as NPLs due to this exceptional measure. So what we recommend is a close monitoring by the Financial Services Authority to avoid unaffordable debt repayment burdens down the road. Okay, so we've seen now the recent economic developments of Indonesia. So let's move a bit further along this charging bar, and we go to the economic outlook for Indonesia. So we project that the Indonesian economy will end up in a recession in 2020 with a 2.2% contraction in 2020. Now, growth is projected to improve in the medium term if the pandemic is well contained. And basically, we recommend it will project will go to 4.4% in 2021 and improve to about 5.1% on average in the medium term. But this is subject to the assumption that the pandemic is well contained, structural reforms are implemented, and help mitigate the impact of the crisis on potential output. Now, we also recommend that current account deficit is going to be contained in the short term, but to gradually widen in the medium term as the trade surplus narrows. This is due to stronger domestic demand, a persistent services trade deficit due to weak international travel, and increased dividend payments to foreign investors as the economic activity and profits recover. Now, finally, we expect inflation to remain low in the short term and to remain within Bank Indonesia's inflation target band in the medium term. Now, let's look at the fiscal balance and the financing a bit more closely, because we think that the budget and financing conditions will be tight in the short term and the next maybe 2 years. So let's start with revenue. So fiscal revenues are projected to recover gradually, driven by the expected improvement in commodity prices. Economic conditions are subject to revenue reforms. Now, expenditures are expected to decrease gradually as fiscal relief measures are gradually phased out in the medium term. However, as we see here on the left, interest payments will increase sharply and will stay high because of the higher level of debt. And this will put pressure on fiscal space. The fiscal deficit is projected to return to 3% by 2023, and public debt is projected to increase significantly to 43% of GDP by 2022 and stabilize thereafter. Now, as you can see in the next chart here on the right, financing the deficit will be more challenging in the next 2 years, as the gross fiscal financing needs are expected to remain elevated in the short term, 9.2% of GDP in 2021. The financing need is expected to be met through domestic and global bond and sukuk issuances, with Bank Indonesia's role as a standby buyer gradually reducing over time in line with falling financing needs. Now, there are risks to the downside, and we'd like to just highlight them here. So first, it's about the future path of the COVID pandemic. Now, a surge of new cases in Indonesia could trigger a reduction in mobility, whether voluntary or due to restrictions. A resurgence of cases in other economies could weaken global growth, trade, and investment flows. And a slower than expected progress on the availability of an effective and safe vaccine could weaken confidence. Now, second, deeper scars from the pandemic shock, for example, potential and actual output could take longer to recover due to deeper scars on the firm's balance sheets and the labor market. And finally, adverse trade and commodity price developments. Weaker global demand or a slower economic recovery amongst the advanced economies in China could weaken the growth and external outlook. Now, if all these risks materialize, we do project a slower recovery, with growth recovering to 3.1% in 2021 and beyond. So finally, let's move to the question of how to secure and accelerate the recovery. So first, we have 4 recommendations. Public health remains a top priority to allow the economy to remain open and to move towards a safe and full reopening. Public confidence that the pandemic is under control is critical for individual social distancing behavior and spending. This requires continuous improvement in testing and tracing capacity and other public health measures. It also requires the preparation to procure and widely administer an effective and safe vaccine once it has been developed and approved. Now, second, monitor and continuously improve the adequacy, targeting, and implementation of the support to affected households and firms. Now, here, the key challenges are to further improve coverage of households and in the bottom 40%, and to expand programs to include affected households in the informal sector. Number 3, on the fiscal front, tax and expenditure measures could help raise resources to finance the crisis response and recovery, contain public debt, and improve fiscal space for priority spending. Now, we have three revenue measures that we would like to point out here. First, broaden the tax base. That means raising excises on products with a negative health or environmental impact. And now make sure that more businesses will pay now that you have lowered the corporate income tax rate. And that means an end to special deals, special regimes, and a lowering of threshold to make sure that profitable smaller companies also are captured in the tax net, since they have the ability to pay post-crisis. Second, make the tax system more progressive. That means increasing the personal income tax rate on top incomes and make sure that more are captured in that bracket. And third, address poor compliance through investment in IT systems, human resources, and other business process reforms at the tax agency. And then finally, at the same time, it is important to phase out the remaining wasteful energy subsidies and replace them by targeted social support, which will increase fiscal space even further. And then fourth and finally, it is critical to advance structural reforms to protect and lift Indonesia's potential to grow, create good jobs, and raise incomes in a sustainable way. Now, the second chapter of this report, presented to you in a bit, is going to take a deep dive into some of those needed reforms in the area of food security. Now, thank you very much for joining this presentation on Indonesia's recent developments and outlook. We hope you enjoyed it. So please send your questions through slido.com, #IEP Bank Dunia. So back to you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Pak Ralph, and you will be answering questions from the audience. Therefore, we would like to invite the audience to send your questions about the presentation. You might have some burning questions about the presentation that Pak Ralph has just delivered. You can do it, as Pak Ralph said, you go to Slido, or you could scan the QR code on your screen that we're showing right now. Scan that code and you will be taken to Slido, or you could go to slido.com, type in the #IEP Bank Dunia. I would just like to remind you to please include your name, also your institution or your media outlet before you submit your questions or within your questions. Now, Pak Ralph will be answering questions later on, but for this part, ladies and gentlemen, I had the opportunity to talk to the governor of Bank Indonesia, Pak Peri Warjio, and I asked him about the strategies that have been taken by the central bank to curb the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also what other efforts are being planned for the future. Here is his answer in a recording that we've conducted earlier. Governor Peri Warjio, the governor of Bank Indonesia, thank you very much for your time with us here, Pak Peri.
My pleasure, Timothy.
So, Governor Peri, I'm sure that a lot of our audience today is eager to hear what the central bank has done to try to tackle the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, we're seeing beginnings of the economic recovery, as you know it, but it has been quite difficult to contain the COVID-19 pandemic and furtherly open the economy. Now, how do you assess the recovery so far, and also how much monetary policy support would be needed to support it?
Thank you, Timothy. I'm optimistic that the process of economic recovery is moving. We are optimistic that starting on the fourth quarter this year, our economic growth will be starting to be small positive and reaching about 4.8 to 5.8% next year, supporting by consumption, export, and investment. This is a result of a very coordinated effort from the government, from the central bank, FSA, OJK, and other parties. Which is, the result of one necessary condition, which is a vaccination, and 5 policy response, which is concerted effort from the government, central bank, OJK, and related agencies. The government, in the process of starting vaccination, as we all know, importation of the vaccine already done, will be starting vaccination. They will be making the mobility of the people, economic activity is moving. But that's also being supported by 5 policy response. First, opening up what I call a productive sector, a sector that supporting our GDP and export is moving up. A sector such as food, some of the mining, as well as some of the industry, I think will be starting to move up. Second is a large fiscal stimulus next year, both to support social program as well as capital expenditure, which is will be rising, and Minister of Finance already communicating this. The third response is, of course, supporting the credit and finance, whereby the Minister of Finance, Central Bank, OJK, under Financial System Stability Forum is coordinated how to match the demand and supply of credit. I think that's to support the lending and financing to the economy. The central bank focus on the fourth policy and the fifth policy. The fourth policy is continuation, as in reply to your question, Timothy, continuing our monetary stimulus as well as accommodative macro prudential. In the area of monetary stimulus, we will continue, our policy of low interest rate until we see some emergence of inflation pressure. We will continue our policy to stabilize the exchange rate, because very important for policy and economic recovery. We will continue to provide ample liquidity. We already providing quantitative easings, 682 trillion, 4.4% of the GDP, the largest in the emerging market. And in the macro-prudential policy, we will continue our accommodative macro-prudential policy, ranging from a very accommodative macro-prudential intermediation ratio, liquidity provision, as well as we are in the process of formulating a macro-prudential policy really supporting productive sector, including the SME. So I think that's the fourth policy, the central bank, in reply to your question, continuing, monetary stimulus as well as accommodative policy.
That would be interesting too. But I would like to go to here, Governor Perry. Now, Bank Indonesia has taken bold steps to respond to the crisis by helping finance the fiscal deficit. Now, how do you evaluate Bank Indonesia's government bond purchase program, and what are your plans of this moving forward?
Well, this is an example how close coordination between the central bank as well as Minister of Finance. As you know, we coordinate closely between Minister of Finance and myself to ensure that economic recovery is moving under the special law, whereby the finance minister allow to increase the fiscal deficit, above 3%. In fact, next year fiscal deficit will be 5.7%, and will also continue in 2022. But after that, fiscal deficit will be lower than 3%. In this time of juncture, the special law also, providing the flexibility of the central bank to participate some of the finance of those budget. We already carry over this in 2020 based on the two agreement between Minister of Finance and myself. The first agreement is how the Bank Indonesia purchase government bond from primary market through non-competitive bidder, through the auction, and so on. The second is, of course, this is the second agreement. This is only apply to 2020 and will not be carried over next year and the following year, which is the central bank able to purchase government bond directly to finance the public's goods and so on. The implementations are going smoothly. That's why the Minister of Finance, the government, can focus on accelerating the fiscal stimulus, which is needed for the economy. And the prudent fiscal policy and prudent monetary policy has been done. So far, under the first agreement, we already purchased 75.86 trillion, while the second agreement we already purchased government bond 397. My apology, 397.56 trillion. In total, we purchased under the first and second agreement for 73.4 trillion. For the 2021, as I said, and with the maximum is 25% for conventional bond, maximum of 30% for the Sharia bond. This is, once again, Timothy, is a testimony in Indonesia, very close coordination, prudent fiscal policy, prudent monetary policy, supporting economic recovery while still maintaining macroeconomic and financial stability, Timothy.
Okay. But
GDP, the largest in the emerging market. So overall financial system stability is sound. We also strengthening the coordination between Bank Indonesia, OJK, and LPS to integrated our supervision of the bank. So we are doing supervision together to ensure bank by bank is sound. The issue what we are facing is how to extend the credit and financing of the banking, to the real sector. This is where I say concerted coordination is important. Fiscal response, fiscal stimulus to increase the demand. That's very important. Central bank continuing monetary stimulus and macroprudential accommodative. The OJK already also extending POJK number 11, whereby restructuring of credit is continuing. What we are focusing now is to match the demand and supply of credit. We go sector by sector, company by company, bank by bank to resolve what we call it the credit crunch issues. This is the issue, and we confident with those concerted effort, the increasing demand, with this demand and supply matching. I think we could believe the lending and from the bank next year will be growing between 6 to 7%. In respond to continuing economic recovery, Timothy.
Okay, so last point, maybe you would like to also elaborate on your fifth point there, where we see an increase in digital payments. How is Bank Indonesia going to support this increase in digital payment services?
Timothy, what we are seeing at the back of the pandemic COVID, the digital economy and finance is flourishing, accelerating very fast in Indonesia. This is what we can see, the size of transaction using e-commerce, electronic money, including also digital banking. And central bank already issue our blueprint of Indonesian payment system 2025 back in May 2019, even before the COVID-19. And we are seeing some progressing digitalization of the economic of finance thanks to our digitalization of the payment system. First, we already scale up our use of QR Indonesian standard, whereby registering the merchant, mostly are SME. This year, about 5.2 million merchant already registered nationally. Next year will be more than double, about 12 million. We also pushing digital banking. We are pushing also fintech, and we are pushing interlink between fintech and digital banking through open application programming interface. We are also in central bank in the process of developing Bank Indonesia fast payment, retail payment 24/7 real time, which is within second. Any retail transaction can be settled from merchant, fintech, digital banking to the central bank. This will be a reform which is a very bold reform. our support of a digital economy and finance. And lastly,
Okay.
we are enjoying the issuing our regulatory reform, which is more agile, inviting innovation, digital technology, and supporting national economic recovery, especially inclusion of the economic and finance, Timothy.
Okay, it's very refreshing seeing the central bank at the forefront of utilizing the technology in this.
Yes.
Governor Periwarjio, thank you very much for your time with us today.
Thank you, Timothy. Stay healthy. Bye-bye.
Stay healthy, stay safe. We'll see you again. Thank you, Governor Perry. Now, although Governor Perry is unable to join us live here today, we would like to thank him again for his time conducting the interview, and also we highly appreciate his contributing insights to our discussion today. Now, I would like to return back to Pak Ralph van Doorn, the acting lead economist for World Bank. Pak Ralph, we have some questions here that have been submitted by the participants through Slido. Once again, I would like to remind everyone you could submit your questions. Just go to slido.com and put in the hashtag IEP Bank Dunia, or you could scan the screen here. Now, Pak Ralph, I have two questions here for you. Let me just read it off Slido here. The first question is from Anissa. The government is legally bound to bring the fiscal deficit below 3% of the GDP by 2023. Now, how can the government reach this objective?
Thank you very much, Tim. Good to see you again. We think the path to go to 3% can be done in two ways, a high quality way and a low quality way. And it's important that Indonesia takes a high quality way to make sure that it's well prepared for the economic recovery. And that means that it has to go through increasing revenue. Indonesia's revenue to GDP ratio at the moment is lower than most low-income countries. And Indonesia, as an aspiring upper middle and upper income country, it has a tax to GDP ratio that's only half of its peers. So the only way to get to get a recovery is through substantially strengthening revenue. Now, of course, you can also cut some of your expenditure, but you have to think about what's wasteful. And you can think about where can you gain efficiencies. And I think the government has already tried to gain efficiencies this year, 2020. But in the future, still the biggest low-hanging fruit remains the wasteful energy subsidies and the fertilizer subsidies. And that's where, and fertilizer subsidies, of course, will be discussed in the next session as part of the agricultural and food security discussion. So on the energy subsidies, we still think that there's a lot of scope to eliminate them, since most of these subsidies in value term are consumed by the top 30%. And it means that if you replace the subsidies by targeted social transfers aimed at the bottom 40%, you make substantial fiscal gains up to about 1.7% of GDP per year. And then, of course, if you then social protection that's targeted will take you a bit to the lower net fiscal gains, but by and all, you still get, it allows you to go to reduce your fiscal deficit back to 3% in a way that improves the progressiveness of the tax system, the progressiveness of expenditure, and also it could be done in a pro-environmental way by cutting wasteful subsidies. And that also places Indonesia, also on the path to a greener future. So we hope that that's the path that the government will take. And we think it's possible to take that path, and we just hope that we'll get there.
How would this be, especially considering that a lot of our economic conditions now at this year is very much affected by external factors like COVID-19, of course. Like if there will be an increase of cases, another outbreak, how fragile would that be, that effort?
Yeah, so we've done some research this year, quarter by quarter, to understand, to what extent does reduced mobility affect economic growth, either by province or by sector. And there's a quite tight relationship. And based on that relationship, we've been estimating, based on the actual mobility, not restrictions, but the actual mobility, we've been looking quarter by quarter what happened to growth. And that's how we ended up with our projection of minus 2.2% for this year. Now, next year, you can imagine a similar type of dynamic. I mean, if there's going to be continuous lockdowns or continuous, maybe, a public reaction perhaps, and people voluntarily decide to socially distance or to stay at home, that will lead to and that will lead to lower growth. And so our baseline is that we are going to have a gradual rollout of a vaccine in Indonesia. We understand that there has already been a substantial budget to do so, and the main challenge will be the actual physical rollout, the establishment of a cold chain to make sure that some of these vaccines that have to be stored at a very low temperature can be transported and safely administered in faraway islands of Indonesia. But subject to that, we project a 4.4% growth. But if you see continuous reductions in mobility and therefore reductions in spending and perhaps production, especially in the contact-intensive service sectors, we do expect growth to only be 3.1% in 2021 and also a bit lower in the remaining years. So it's important for the government to remain the public confidence and really plan carefully the rollout of the vaccine. That's important. But also to make sure to understand that the vaccine is not a silver bullet. The silver bullet is personal hygiene. It is a form of social distancing. It's wearing masks. It is contact tracing and a lot of testing. And that's where Indonesia can still have a lot of gains. And we hope that they will implement that.
If you could just give a brief answer due to the time constraints. It's from Andra from the Ministry of Finance. What do you think and your suggestions for Bank Indonesia's burden sharing scheme for the next year? And also, how about Indonesia's debt sustainability and risk? Paraf.
Yeah, now we think that debt sustainability is not the problem so much in Indonesia. And even if Indonesia's debt goes to from 30% pre-crisis to around 44% of GDP in the medium term, it's still well below that of many other peer countries and also well below its own fiscal rule. The question really is about how to finance it, because Indonesia has a very shallow financial market. And that's also where you see that at the moment, about 30% of local government debt is held by non-residents. So in the medium term, it's important to continue to develop the financial market to make sure that you capture more of the savings into the formal financial sector through pensions and insurance development, and that will help, both help with the investment, but also with reducing the risk to the government. But in the shorter term, yes, we do expect indeed that Bank of Indonesia will remain a standby buyer, as they've announced. But we expect that it's important for Indonesia to maintain its fiscal reputation, to make sure that they continue to issue global bonds of Sukuk at rates commensurate with the investment grade rating, and that non-resident investors will come back to make sure that they will capture and fill out the gaps in the lack of depth of the financial market in Indonesia at the moment. But it's very important to not only think then about next year, but also to continue for the Ministry of Finance and Bank of Indonesia to remain transparent as they've been so far about the burden sharing scheme, and to have a credible exit strategy, so that the market retains its confidence and Indonesia, retains its access to the market on the conditions it has today.
Acting lead economist of World Bank Indonesia, thank you very much for your presentation, also for answering the questions from the audience. Once again, thank you very much, Paraf. Now, we invite you to join the conversation on social media by following our Twitter account at Bank Dunia and also using the hashtag IEP Bank Dunia for our conversation today. Now, ladies and gentlemen, our next presentation is on food security, which will be delivered by World Bank's lead agriculture economist, Bapak Animesh Srivastava. Now, to begin, here's a brief video to take us to the presentation.
Food security is an important goal for Indonesia, and the country has made progress in staple food production. Rice and maize are now widely available, but imports of high-value and processed foods have increased fivefold since the early 2000s because local production could not keep up with demand. Today, Indonesia's food security challenges are more about affordability and nutritional value of foods. Indonesia's food prices are among the highest in Asia, including rice and nutritious foods such as fruits, vegetables, and livestock products. This is mainly due to high cost of processing, logistics and trade, and low competitiveness of the food sector. The COVID-19 crisis has highlighted weaknesses of the agri-food system, but also brings an unprecedented opportunity to transform the system. The World Bank report makes 3 recommendations. First, broaden the food security agenda beyond self-sufficiency in rice and strategic commodities to a more balanced consideration of the availability, affordability, and quality of food for all. Second, adjust agri-food policy goals, instruments, and redefine their scope. Third, improve the quality of public spending by allocating more resources to enhancing productivity, innovation, food quality, and food safety. For more info, visit www.worldbank.org/Indonesia.
Thank you, Tim. Alistair, eminent guests, distinguished participants in this Indonesia Economic Prospects launch event, Ibu Victoria, Ibu Satu, and other World Bank colleagues linking in from different locations. I'm Animesh Srivastava, the lead agriculture economist for the East Asia Pacific region. And I'm delighted to have this opportunity to present to you the latest food security report from the World Bank Group. This is an important opportunity to talk about food security. The COVID-19 associated pandemic has raised food security concerns globally. And in Indonesia, the government has put it on top of its agenda of priority issues to address. COVID-19 everywhere, and in this country in particular, has brought food security to focus and invited a new perspective on agri-food policy. The pandemic generated temporary spike in household food shortages. We noticed through our survey work, for instance, that in May, nearly 33% of the surveyed households reported shortage in food. It also disrupted local supply chains, playing havoc in local markets with availability of various kinds of foods. However, these did not last long, and over the summer months, the situation eased considerably. Equally importantly, the pandemic produced a huge policy response in terms of social welfare programs of a large and massive nature that focused on mitigating the impacts of food-related difficulties at the household level. In terms of the broader trends of significance, it's important to note that the pandemic also revealed that food supply situation remained robust. What it revealed then is that the food insecurity at the household level was less a consequence of lack of availability of basic cereals, grains, rice in case of Indonesia, and more problems in able to afford and access some of those foods. And therefore, the experience of the pandemic reinforced what was already known in policy circles and through various evidence and data that agri-food policy needs to focus more on nutrition and healthy diets. There's a sense that was created early on in the crisis that there will be shortages of food supply. There were initial import and export restrictions, particularly from some exporting countries, but these were quickly reversed. In fact, these two charts convey a very important message. The first chart measures the movement of cereal prices, of agriculture prices, and global exports in key cereals through this year of the pandemic. And it does not deviate much from its reference line of January 2020. To put these movements into perspective, it's useful to look at the second chart on the right, which measures the cereal price index and the food price index over a much longer period. The main takeaway message from the chart on the right is that the two times there were significant global food crises in 2007-8 and in 2011-12, there were very significant price spikes. That is not visible today. So the situation on the food stocks, the situation on food stocks outlook is stable. To understand where Indonesia stands with respect to food security and what are the challenges and choices it faces, it's good to have a sense of being the target of policies. Rice, maize, sugar, in particular, as we can see in this chart over a period of some nearly 20 years, have shown a self-sufficiency ratio, which is roughly the amount of domestically produced or sourced values of these commodities over what is consumed at 80% or above. So the agriculture and food policies have focused on shoring up domestic self-sufficiency for strategic commodities. And at a higher level, there are two other characteristics to note. One, that Indonesia has tended to provide a lot of support to the agricultural sector. If one took an overall measure of the economic resources devoted to agriculture sector, some kind of total support as the OECD calls it, and compares it to the GDP of the country, then the graph on the left shows that currently Indonesia is providing 2.94%, nearly 3% in 2019 of its GDP in various forms of support or expenditure to the agricultural sector. What is key takeaway from this graph is that this level of support is an outlier with respect to most other countries, and some of these are the big agricultural powerhouses of the world, whether that's Australia, Brazil, Chile, New Zealand, Canada. The level of support is quite large in Indonesia. The graph on the right shows the pattern of support, and just two segments of it, irrigation and fertilizer subsidies, account for more than between half and 3/4 of the central government spending in this regard. These expenditures essentially go in supporting production of key commodities, but they do squeeze out expenditure on research and development, on extension, on diversification, on promotion of new crops and technologies, new markets, processing, and so on. The expenditures that are squeezed out have an impact on the growth of the sector. And this is the picture that this graph brings out, that growing expenditure on agriculture in Indonesia has not been matched by growing productivity. The three columns in green represent productivity growth in Indonesia over the 3 decades, 90s, 2000, and 2010. And at least in the 2010, the productivity growth rate is lower despite rising government expenditure. This is an important critical fact because income growth, prosperity of agriculture sector, prosperity of farmers depends totally, crucially on productivity growth. Another consequence of the particular pattern of expenditure in Indonesia, which is a high amount of support provided through a few instruments like subsidies and market price support, as well as import and export restrictions to sustain those market prices, has been that the sector has not been as competitive. And in fact, the prices paid by Indonesian consumers are among the highest in the region. The graph on the top shows the retail price of paddy over a period of almost 8 years. And the prices in Indonesia are higher than other rice producing and consuming countries in the region, and often by a significant margin. Another consequence, which is relevant to food security debate of the pattern of expenditure, is that the focus on strategic commodities has meant that growth in livestock and horticulture and other produce, which are both nutritious as well as high income earning commodities, has not matched the potential that Indonesia has. And this is shown in the graph on the bottom, where Indonesia is being compared to Vietnam and Thailand, which have similar natural endowments. In fact, Indonesia has very considerable endowments in terms of its production and other diversity. And yet, the export of fruits and vegetables in Indonesia's case is much lower. It's the green bar, is much lower than other countries, whereas the imports is higher, similar level to other countries. So it shows that Indonesian farmers are missing out on opportunities of income growth, job growth, export growth through diversification. And the final consequence that we want to note is that this focus on few strategic staples, which are cereals and starch-based, is that there are significant nutritional gaps. Diet diversity index is among the lowest in Indonesia in the East Asia Pacific region, and that has consequences. Stunting levels for children under 5, although it has been coming down, is still over 30% in 2019. The proportion of people who are overweight or have obesity problems is well over a fifth of the population. The non-communicable diseases, whether it is diabetes or cardiovascular diseases and others, are on a rising trend. And the graph on the right shows, for instance, that the human capital productivity loss in Indonesia due to these diet-related health issues is very significantly high. So going forward, what are some of the choices? What are some of the issues? What are some of the options to improve the food and nutritional security status of the country by strengthening its agro-food system? The first that this analysis really brings out is that we need to broaden the food security approach beyond adequacy of cereals to include affordability and nutritional adequacy issues. Second, we need to readjust the food security policy goals and instruments. And third, we need to improve the quality of public spending to enhance productivity and innovation in the agri-food system. In terms of food security policy goals, we need to move from increasing outputs and stabilizing self-sufficiency to focus more on increasing productivity of crops as well as livestock. That's where you get diversity, nutritional food supply, and more importantly, income growth. Second, we need to change the structure of policies to move away from supporting selected crops and towards encouraging a structural transformation of agriculture that is diversified and benefits all farmers. And as part of that, we need to have a policy change that takes away the import restrictions that make domestic market conditions uncompetitive towards one that helps open vast export markets for domestic producers. Development of the agri-food system in this way can advance other national priorities. It can boost agricultural incomes. It can enhance economic inclusion because it will generate more incomes for the smaller farmers who tend to be the hardcore of poverty in Indonesia, as in many other countries. It will increase jobs as we get into diversification, processing, trading, and value chain development. It will certainly help realize Indonesia's vast potential for food exports, promote environmental sustainability, and on the consumer side, offer more food, choice, and convenience, both through production and processing and food services industry, promote nutritional adequate and healthy diets, which will help bring down the burden of foodborne diseases. Because it will be more productive, it will help to permanently lower the prices that Indonesian consumers pay against the currently very high level of food prices and lay the foundations of a more competitive agricultural sector, which will enhance its long-term growth potential. Those are the messages from our report, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Pak Animesh, and I would like to humbly ask you to stay with us here on the screen as we continue to a panel discussion that follows your presentation. And for that, I would like to invite two other speakers who will join us. First is Professor Busnanul Arifin, a professor of agriculture economics from the University of Lampung, or UNILA, and also Bapak Syrojuddin Arif, the lead author of the Strategic Review of Food Security and Nutrition in Indonesia, who is also a researcher at Semeru. Thank you for joining us as well, Professor Busnanul, and also Pak Siroj. Now, before I begin, I would like to remind everyone that you may submit your questions by going through slido.com and typing the hashtag IEP Bank Dunia. And also, please also write down your name, your institution or media outlet, and to whom your question is directed at. My first question here is for Pak Busnanul. Pak Busnanul, the report, as we've seen, recommends that Indonesia shift the strategic focus of its food security goals from self-sufficiency to more holistic view of food security that includes food availability, affordability, and also food quality. Now, do you agree with this assessment, and what reforms are needed to make this change? Pak Busnanul.
Thank you, Tim. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the presentation, Pak Animesh, and all the panels from Ibu Satu, Pak Raf, and Pak Ros. Of course, I agree. I totally support that we should not go exclusively develop what we call it here at home. We call it food sufficiency or self-sufficiency, maybe to be more frankly, rice self-sufficiency. We have to broaden, Tim. We have to broaden the audience and broaden the scope to include availability, accessibility, which is affordability actually, and utilization, which is consumption. If we could do this, we could expand that. I think we should not talk only about sectoral. Food security is about everything. Normally, Pak Tim, I mentioned food security not only about supply and demand, but about this, about the reform in the food you take it. This the quality of food, the nutrition. The government have seriously focused on that to broaden the reform to become food system approach. Okay, food system approach is everything. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, but actually we broaden the argument as well to include the sustainability, environmental welfare, of course, and social welfare. So this is really comprehensive. Probably your question earlier, how do we do the reform? So this also include the layers of government. Okay, they can do the job. There's a policy. I think you know about Law 18/2012. Everybody translate this as really to be comprehensive, not only self-sufficiency, but it's more physical. Food security is more on human resources development. There we go. If you do reform on that, directing to really first during the pandemic, we have to make sure everybody has to have access. Our access is not suitable to be. There's no obstacle in our access. Access is very important. There is no point, Pak Tim, if you problem availability, but problem with access is everywhere. I think this we be in trouble. This is why social assistance is very important. BPNT. BPNT is actually targeted food subsidies, okay? Non-cash food subsidies, also very important. If you mention about the crop diversification, as Animes mentioned earlier, yes, of course. This is why normally I think we can check my paper, my writing. I propose local food. Local food is very important. I think we can continue this later, Fatima. I'll go back to you. Thank you.
You raised about access, which is still an issue. Now then, I'll move on to Pa Siroj, and Professor Bustano also already mentioned about nutrition. Now, nutrition is an important part of the definition of food security here, Pa Siroj. Yet, policymakers often focus on physical availability of staple foods rather than the nutritional value of food. Now, in your opinion, how should this be addressed?
Okay, thank you, Pak Tim, and thank you, Pak Animes, for your insightful presentation. First of all, I would also thank the World Bank team for having me today, and thanks also for ladies and gentlemen for staying with us. So back to your question, Pak Tim. Let me put my answer into the context. So first of all, let me add that actually the government has put, say, some attention to the nutrition. Actually, we have program on nutrition, we have, say, national plan on food and nutrition, etc. But there are some problems in the way the government, the policies are, say, implemented, or also in the design and the policies. First of all, so say there are organizational silos, or say barriers between different lines of ministries that made collaboration on, or say cross-fertilization of program difficult among these ministries. So that's the one thing. The other thing is that we the direction that we have. So we have a guide in terms of food security. We have what people call as Pola Pangan Harapan, or desirable dietary patterns. So despite the dietary pattern, according to the score, actually the score that the country has now is quite high, around 92. But if you look at the global index about the dietary patterns of Indonesia, as Pak Animes also has shown us, we are among the lowest among the countries. So despite the fact that we are good in terms of the national dietary pattern, but when compared to other countries, we are performing bad. So that's a problem. So at least, again, two problems. Here is organizational silos between ministries, and then the second one is the guide that the government actually intended to go to that direction. So in this context, we see that at least there are 2 points that should be made by the government. First is that, well, now actually there should be some improvement in the PPH, in the Pola Pangan Harapan. That the fact shows that actually PPH doesn't give us the best indicators of a good healthy food, right? So even though we are quite high on the PPH, but we are low on the food dietary diversity. That's the problem. So if we compare between PPH and, say, the other dietary patterns in international standard, for example, the one recommended by the Lancet Commission, our PPH give too much emphasis on cereal, on rice, on staple. It's around 50%, while other dietary patterns give probably around 30% than the Lancet Commission. So that's certainly an issue. That's why that despite we are high on PPH, but we are still struggling with dietary. So one solution is probably there is strong need to improve the PPH. So at least to revise it, to make it a good guide for us to improve food security. Secondly, with regard to the organizational silos, again, to reiterate Pak Busno's point, that it is important to view food and nutrition as a system, not as a compartmentalized division, but as a food system. So to achieve this goal, we believe that based on our study with our colleague at Semeru, there is need to strengthen the institutional or the governance of food security as food and nutrition as a system. So in the last several years, there is a proposal to develop a specific agency to to supervise, to monitor, or to address food and nutrition as a system. But again, that's not the only way to strengthen the governance, and probably that's one of the issues that for the last few years the idea become unpopular. But probably rather than developing, for example, other than developing one specific agency, probably we can strengthen the existing agency. For example, now we have a specific agency for addressing Tim Percepatan Penanggulangan Stunting. Probably we can strengthen this institution by expanding the authority, by expanding the coverage of the program to oversee, to focus not only on stunting but also on other problems related to nutrition, or to strengthen, to see the food security, the food and nutrition as one system. Thank you.
Bustanul, because I want to touch upon another part of the report, which suggests that fertilizer subsidies, Bustanul, could be reduced in phases and better targeted, and savings could be reallocated to more productive public investment. Now, does Indonesia need to reform its fertilizer subsidy program, and what can be done in this area?
Thank you, Mas Tim. Well, probably the question, not yes or no question, but how do we do reform on that? Okay, I think everybody knows in this arena. Okay, the cost of fertilizer, I think the share is only about less than 10%. Okay, of the total production cost of rice, maize, and soybean. This is the one that three crops are using fertilizer very much. Okay. So the highest cost, the highest share of the production cost is actually on the wage. Okay, labor cost is very high, almost 50%. The second highest is on the what you call the land rent. It's about 30%. The rest is smaller. Okay. So if we want to reform not only the use of fertilizer, but use that public money for infrastructure, for improving the human resources in agriculture, for mechanization, there we go. Okay, if we know the labor cost is the highest, this is why we cannot compete, that's why we're importing rice actually. So I think reforming in efficiency of input, which is machinery, mechanization, I think this is one point. The second point, if we could do improving the technology, production technology, to really improve the production efficiency. Pak Anime's paper mentioned about total factor productivity. Our works also mentioned about total factor productivity is also very low. That technological change is part of the improving the competitiveness within the agriculture. Okay, the government, as far as I know, I think Pak Tim seriously go for reforms. I think if you go to next year, the budget, as far as I know, is 25.3 trillion, which is quite a reduction from 2 years ago, 29 trillion. So all the way has been reduced, but reallocate first to improve the competitiveness within agriculture sector. The second is actually to really reallocate the targeted subsidy by using shifting. Actually, this is a big reform. Shifting the subsidy from the products to the farmers. That's why we have to use Kartu Tani. Kartu Tani is farmer's card, where you have to integrate with ERDKK. ERDKK is actually the plan of all farmers group, collected, submitted to Ministry of Agriculture. From that, the fertilizer subsidy has been implemented. We've been in the field doing field verification for that, but unfortunately, there are a lot of works to do because farmers' cards have to be integrated with the banking system. The banking system, I think now is only 3 involved: Mandiri, BRI, and the other one is BNI. To serve how much? 21 million. It is a lot of work. But again, since the reform is really direct to the people, to the farmers really need it. I think I don't have to mention the current research, previous research as well from our colleague, mentioning that those receiving the subsidy is not really the poor farmers, somehow these rich farmers. That have to be reformed, okay? When we ask question, I think have to be a systematic research on that. We asking question to farmers. Do you really, can you afford to pay higher than 2,000 rupiah? Yes, of course. Maybe they can pay higher because today, Pak Tim, the subsidized fertilizers is only less than 2,000. The market price is 5,500, sometimes 6,000. You don't have to be economist to really expect that there will be something, there will be distortion on that. So this has to be reduced periodically because you cannot do big bang on that, otherwise have political consequences. I agree, totally agree, that we have to reallocate, there we go, reallocate the subsidy to be to other use. For me, if I can choose for research and development, for improving the human resources, including the extension. If you go to the field, people want to have, our farmers want to have ask question. To whom they ask the question if there is no extension guy in the field. This thing have to be reformed. And the third, we have to involve private sectors in the production process and all the way to value chain. This actually, this reform have to be, I think we have to watch carefully on that part. Thank you.
Pak Animesh, I guess we could find that answer interesting, but I would like to know your analysis, Pak Animesh, to what have other countries approached these kind of reforms, and also what are the ingredients for success here?
Thank you, Tim. I think if you look at the other countries' experience, and by the way, I really do fully agree with what Pa Bustinul and Pa Siroj were saying, very helpful contributions. If you look to the experience of the other countries, the one thing that comes through very clearly is that the most powerful thing to do is to create the market conditions, the right incentives, and to provide the right form of public support for producers to become more effective, more efficient, and so on. Look at the example, recent example from Philippines. In 2019, they had this rice tariffication law, and they ended the quota restrictions on imports. Now, of course, that even in the short time that we have, we can see or note some effects. Prices have come down. Very interestingly, the proportion of high-value crops, the share of high-value crops in agricultural GDP has gone up by 2.3%. And more so in rain-fed areas. Those are the more marginal, the more insecure areas where public support does not reach so well. So it's had quite a nice impact in terms of introducing dynamism to the agricultural sector. It has brought down prices, and the tariffs have generated revenue for the government, which it can redeploy towards producer support in agriculture. And similarly, Bangladesh, quite a few years back, 1993, it had tried the same reforms, liberalize, remove import restrictions, allow private sector. And there we have quite a period of time to study the impact. And the readout is very positive. Private sector investment has grown in milling, in storage, private sector storage, which carries less stocks but is more efficient. An interesting indicator is that the two food price crises that were in the presentation 2007-8, 2011-12, with this liberalized regime, Bangladesh was able to go through both those food price crises with much more stability than you would have feared beforehand. So liberalizing, working with the market. China is another example. It has now, interestingly, adopted a policy of moderating self-sufficiency, producing more in line, if you like, with its competitive advantage, with market demands, and so on. So the self-sufficiency ratio in China, which used to be something like 94.5 in 2015, they are targeting to bring it down to 91% by 2025 and rely more on international trade, even for some things that are regarded as strategic commodities like rice, like sugar, like soya, like dairy products. So that's one clear lesson from international experience, that if one can reframe the policies, and that's why it's one of the messages in our report as well. If we can revisit the policy goals, the policy targets, the policy instruments, in order to create the right incentive and market conditions, then the response from the producer, the supply response, is tremendous. The positive benefits at the consumer level is also quite high. So those are some of the lessons that reinforce the messages that were in the paper and that I hear our colleague panelists also endorse. Thank you.
Now, I still have a lot of questions for all the panelists here, but I'm sure that the attendees would also like to submit their questions and ask them to our panelists. Therefore, I'll just go straight to the Q&A with receiving questions from Slido. We already have a couple of questions here. I'll just direct it to the names that have been written here. Our first question from Slido comes from Kevin O'Rourke from Reformasi Weekly. For Pak Bustanul, with the foreign ownership limit on horticulture lifted via the Jobs Omnibus, is there a potential for foreign investment to improve productivity and efficiency? Pak Bustanul.
Thank you, Pak Tim. Thank you for the question. Who asking? I forget the name.
Kevin. This is Kevin O'Rourke.
Kevin. Okay, Kevin. Actually, if you read the Omnibus Law, well, it's not directly addressed, but as long as you want to invest on horticulture, I think, as far as I know, it's really easier this time. But again, it depends on the specificity of the investment you're doing. Okay, the highest, if you want to call the highest probability of obtaining profits is really on horticulture. But you have to have very specific, okay? Do high exotic Indonesian agriculture. That's the demand is there, and I think you can have the top of the consumer's level. That's also very important. You can get benefit on that. But I would like to add about seed, Kevin, maybe a team. Actually, the opportunity for seed business and horticulture, I think, is still there, still open. Of course, there's some technical requirement, administrative requirement. You have to register to ministry and so on. But again, horticulture is quite quick yielding compared to estate crop, for example. Okay, once you get good production and productivity, farmers will stay. But again, sorry, I have to mention again, somebody have to be there with farmers. While extension service reform is also very important. Maybe I'm subjective because I'm doing something for extension this time, but this is very important. Otherwise, no, you cannot do that. Of course, the methodology have to be changed, not like last time where everybody officials go, no, not that. You have to use technology this time, okay? Providing maybe something like add-on. If you want to, okay, I want to grow watermelon, this and that, and what is requirement? I think everything have to be by the cell phone this time. This kind of information together with investment, I think the opportunity, what Animesh mentioned about the crop diversification should be there. Of course, if you want to have the local food, I mentioned earlier, local food, because you have to relate with some other activities, including culture, cultural rich, culinary, and so on. So crop diversification will provide opportunities for improving the welfare of farmers. Thank you.
Professor Bustanul, that may answer the question from Kevin. Our next question comes from Richard Von Harach from the Rotary Club of Jakarta Metropolitan. This is for Pak Siraj. Pak Siraj, stunting is reported to go up, not down, during COVID. Please confirm. Also, if you have further comments on this, Pak Siraj.
Well, data on stunting right now, it's quite difficult to collect, right? So it's difficult to know precisely how is the stunting level at this time, right? Because it's difficult to collect that information. But we can predict that, yes, Indonesia will have to struggle to address the problem because of some issues. First is that because, as Pak Anim has mentioned, that because of loss in jobs and people are struggling to have their basic need met. So there are some possibility that food consumption, not only in terms of the quantity, but also the quality will decline. So because of this, so it is reasonable to expect that the quality of nutrition will decline. So if that happens for, say, for the pregnant mothers and then the small children, so the outcome is probably the goal to reduce the stunting by probably to less than 20% during the next few years will be probably will not be met. That's the first issue. The second point is that because of the pandemic, so the basic health services, so the operation of Posyandu and Puskesmas to some point are also disrupted. So the recent news from the Ministry of Health is that the coverage of basic immunization, for example, actually declined quite significantly compared to the previous year. So this is this is in terms of the quality of the nutrition and then the health basic health services. So it will affect the way the country try to reduce the stunting. So yes, if people say probably the stunting will grow, probably yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your answer, Pak Siroj. Let me see if I still have time here for another question from Slido. Because we're actually running very late here, but we would like to thank all the panelists and also everyone attending our event today for staying with us throughout the event. But it looks like that we no longer have time. I regret to say that is all the time we have for today. Therefore, I would like to thank Bapak Animesh Srivastava, the lead agriculture economist for World Bank, also Professor Bustanul Arifin, Professor of Agriculture Economics from the University of Lampung or UNILA, and also Pak Sirojudin Arif from Semeru for enlightening us throughout our discussion and also for answering the questions that have been sent by our participants today. Also to all participants, we thank you for your attention and interaction. We apologize that we couldn't answer all the questions that you have submitted, but hopefully we've covered some very important matters throughout the discussion today. Now we have reached the end of the event of the IEP launch December 2020. For your information, the report can be downloaded. All you need to do is go to worldbank.org/IEP. And also don't forget, you could get the latest information regarding the World Bank programs via our Twitter account @BankDunia. And a reminder to our journalist friends, please hold on. We will hold a press conference right after this. You could join by using the press conference icon on your screen. When you submit your questions, please submit your name, the media outlet you work for, and also your questions there. Now, once again, I'd like to thank everyone for your attendance. I'm Timothy Marbun, and on behalf of the World Bank and everyone involved in making this event, we hope to see you again in the next launch of the Indonesia Economic Prospects Reports. Stay safe, everyone. Goodbye and have a nice day.